Okay, let's get started. Firstly, thank you for coming to this session. I know there's a lot of choice with Ignite, and I want to thank you first for attending. So today we're covering Azure and AWS, comparing DR and backup capabilities. My name is, My name is Daniel Ma. I'm a principal consultant with a company called Infront Consulting. It's my Twitter handle if you want to keep in touch. I mainly work in consulting. I've got a background with System Center, Hyper-V, and really just been working with Azure Infra at this stage. I kind of talk more to an IT pro audience as well. My accent comes from New Zealand, but I spent about 15 years in Singapore kind of doing this stuff up there. I only recently come into Australia about 2 years ago. All right. Okay. This click is not going to work, is it? All right, what are we going to cover today? So really we're going to look at backup and DR from a high-level point of view, and then we're going to kind of look at what Azure has in backup and DR and what AWS has in backup and DR. And we'll move the conversation into three main areas: DR in the cloud, backup in the cloud, and using hybrid storage in the cloud. And then we'll close off with basically a look at what third-party solutions out there supporting Azure backup and Azure DR scenarios. Okay. This is not working. Okay. All right. So let's begin with disaster recovery. When we talk about disaster recovery, we talk about these terms: RTO, RPO, recovery time objective, recovery point objective. We're talking typically recovery to another site. We're replicating to another site, whether that's in a cloud or another secondary data center. And we have recovery plans, and we typically want to do regular DR testing. And it's really about short-term recovery here. We want to recover to the last known consistent point in time, right? Whereas backup, we're typically talking about long-term retention. We want to keep data for a longer term. We want to be able to recover from a point that was further back than yesterday, for instance. So don't get the two confused. Backup can act as a DR strategy, actually. But what we'll be looking at across the rest of the session is really comparing and looking at the functionality, the features, the hybrid aspects of a DR backup scenario, and also the cost. All right, so let's start off with a high-level comparison of AWS and Azure. So really, I don't really need to read it out to you. They're fairly similar in most of the major areas. So EC2, you've got virtual machines, S3 storage, we have blob storage, there's ExpressRoute, Direct Connect, and more recently, Microsoft introduced this cool blob storage, which is a cheaper tier of storage, which is there to match their Glacier storage. So kind of the areas you'd be looking at with DR and backup with Amazon and Azure would be the Glacier storage, the cool blob storage, Amazon Snowball, Azure import, export. They're fairly similar features and products to get your data into the cloud, for instance. The focus for today, though, is really around these three areas. So we'll be looking at the DR strategy from an AWS perspective, what Microsoft has in that area, and their product is called Azure Site Recovery. The backup strategy and the Azure backup product, or backup as a service product. And AWS has a storage gateway, Microsoft has Store Simple. Before we get into this, who actually has infrastructure in AWS today? Show of hands. A number of you. Who's actually looked at Azure Site Recovery from a Microsoft? Run a trial, set it up. Backup? Okay. Store Simple. Anyone running Store Simple in this environment? Okay, quite a few of you. All right. Good. So I'll frame the presentation in that way. Okay. So let's start off by looking at disaster recovery in the cloud. And really from the perspective of AWS, their cloud, their DR strategy is really around these 4 scenarios, looking at backup and restore, light pilot, warm standby, multi-site. The documentation on their websites back from 2014, downloading some of the white papers there. So really, to be honest, they don't really have a DR strategy here. They rely on partners, third-party partners, and their software to provide DR capability into the cloud. So from the Microsoft perspective, they're a lot more advanced. We have the concept of a Azure Site Recovery Vault. And these recovery vaults is what we use for backup as well as DR. So Site Recovery both use them. We can support VMware, Hyper-V, physical servers, and even migration from AWS. Some of the things we can do once we've configured our, when we're doing DR, we're replicating to the cloud. Once we've replicated to the cloud, we can do things like planned failover, unplanned failover, test failover. Test failover being very, very important because we need to do a proper DR test. Convince the bosses that, our DR site is what is working and we're paying for what we're using. So the tool can also allow us to do migration, and I'll go a bit more detail into this, how you actually use Azure Site Recovery to migrate your VMs from on-premises into the cloud. And it's now available across most Azure regions. Australia here, we got it fairly early, but it recently got introduced in Canada and UK as well. And the Azure to Azure scenario we'll talk a little bit about, but you'll see more of that in, there's another session on Azure Site Recovery that's Nirmal, one of my friends is presenting that. We'll get into that. Okay. Okay, so if we look at the complete solution from Microsoft, we have a site-to-site. Now, this is not talking about cloud at all. It's from your primary data center to another secondary data center, which it might be a premises that you own. So support the VMware physical scenario. We support the Hyper-V scenario. We're not going to focus too much on this today. What we're going to focus on is really the primary site. It's on-premises. You have some infrastructure here, whether it's VMware, Hyper-V, physical, and we're going to look at what options we have to migrate or back that up, DR that to the cloud. So firstly, it's all, we can protect all this on-premise infrastructure into the cloud with Azure. We also have the option to move infrastructure or protect infrastructure you have in AWS into Azure as well. And this one is coming up, the Azure Cloud to Azure Cloud. So if you are already cloud first, you have all your infrastructure in the cloud to begin with, we need a DR site in case that Azure region goes down. So that's the Azure to Azure piece of the DR puzzle. So just a quick look at some guidance around creating what we call these recovery services vaults. So it's a public Azure service, first of all. Just remember that we don't need a site-to-site VPN into a virtual network into Azure to do DR. It's publicly available. We just need an internet connection. We can have up to 25 recovery services vault per subscription, probably more than enough for your requirements. If you need more, create more subscriptions. Then we look at it from 2 areas, the site recovery area and the Azure backup area. So from the site recovery perspective, we can protect up to 250 servers per vault. If you have any more, then create additional vaults. There's also some guidance on storage accounts, how many disks you have in a storage account as well. I've got some links later that I can share with it. On the Azure backup side, these are the kind of limits as well. So 50 machines registered per vault. You can protect up to 200 VMs that are running in Azure to a vault. And also in terms of how often you can do your backups, we've got some limits there as well. We'll go into a bit more detail about this later. Okay, before we get into that, I'll just basically go through a... All right. Just going to quickly show you what a vault is. So everyone's probably familiar with this portal. There's also a new portal now. If you go preview.portal.azure.com, you've got a preview portal to this. We'll use the normal portal though. So we have here a number of recovery services vaults. Now, I've got a number here, but really it comes down to how you want to structure your environment. I've got recovery services vault for backup, and I've got recovery services vault for DR. You can actually combine the two. The concept of the recovery services vault is that that construct can support backup and DR in the same vault. But maybe for admin purposes, maybe you've got a different team that does backup, another team that does disaster recovery. You might want to segregate the two. So in my environment, I've kind of separated it into a separate vault for backup, separate vault for DPM backup, a number of separate vaults for Hyper-V workloads, for VMware workloads, for physical workloads. So I'm not really reaching those maximums, but this is kind of how I've gone about creating this environment. So if I drill down into my VMware site recovery services vault, I'm actually protecting things here. The first thing you do after you've created the vault is really, you can click on this Getting Started and Site Recovery. Now, it's a wizard-based interface. So the first really things that you need to do is prepare the infrastructure. Now, it gives you a lot of guidance on how you configure and what you need to download and the different scenarios that are supported. So we have this Azure to Azure scenario. We also have to recovery site. So that's the site-to-site. So under the Azure, we have different options here. We have to Hyper-V, we have to VMware, and to the non-virtualized and other. That's really caters for the physical servers as well as from any cloud, from AWS, from a partner-hosted cloud, and so on. So we would basically run through all of these steps to configure our infrastructure. So I'm going to jump back to the slides and give some guidance around really how you configure the different types of protection. So recall we have VMware protection, VMware VMs. Who's running VMware in the environment? Probably the majority of you. This is Australia after all. Hyper-V? Who's running Hyper-V? A few of you as well. Okay. And physical servers. I hope no one's raising that. It's still got physical servers out there. How do you do DR on your physical servers today? That's the question I ask. Anyway, we're going to talk about the VMware VM protection first. So VMware protection is based on a product they acquired. And the whole concept of this is revolving around a configuration server. This server that you have on-premise that handles the replication. Just remember with VMware replication, we're doing continuous replication. So we have this config server, and we have the workload that we're replicating. So on the workload we're replicating, we install an agent, and that talks to our config server, and then the config server then replicates the changes up to Azure, up to an Azure storage account. Kind of some areas around here, the product they acquired actually, it uses a MySQL database. They haven't updated that to SQL. Make sure your time sync on that server is in sync with Azure time. If you don't, you're going to run into a lot of problems. Having the latest version, this in the brackets there, 9.6, that's the latest version of the config server. It does update very frequently. So if you're going to run this VMware protection, just check the version updates. They'll notify you with that. And if we're protecting VMware, we need the VMware PowerShell CLI, and you have to use this version. I've tried other versions and it's failed. So some specific requirements around that. We download what we call a vault registration key. So this is the key that identifies our recovery services vault. And then we connect to our VMware infrastructure. Now, one server can manage quite a number of VMs. So a single process server up to 200 VMs, changes of up to 2 terabytes a day. Now, really the sizing around this, I did this at one customer. We used VMware protection and replicated a couple VMs up to Azure. We worked out that their service provider wasn't skimping on the bandwidth they were assigned. So they assigned them 200 meg, and we flooded that pipe, pushing all that across the internet. So if you're going to be pushing a lot of things up into the cloud or replicating, that initial replication, consider ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute has the public peering, which is a dedicated path into Azure Public Services. So you can actually have additional process servers. So if you're going to be replicating, and it's continuous replication here, so if you're going to be replicating quite a lot, you might want to have multiple process servers on premises. So as I mentioned, there's this mobility agent that exists on each workload that you're replicating into Azure with the VMware scenario. So you actually install this mobility service. Now, kind of a best practice, and that's on the next slide, is how do we go about deploying this mobility service? So why do you need to deploy the mobility service up front first? Mobility service can be either pushed, so when you select the VM to be protected, you can it will automatically push that agent there, but I always recommend a pre-install. We pre-install so we can. And one of the key benefits is seeing which disks we want to protect. And I'll have a video and I'll go through a demo on this. But some of the techniques to deploy that mobility service to that VM that you want to protect, we can do a manual install. It's a wizard-based install. We can use enterprise deployment tools like SCCM, config manager to deploy that. There's recent guidance, it's about a week old, using Azure Automation now to deploy that mobility service, and we can also use scripted methods. So let me jump into a video now and see this in action. So this is sorry, I'm going to switch over. Okay, so this is my Azure subscription again. No, there's no audio. That's just. So this is how we go about enabling protection for a VM. So for a VMware scenario, we select our config server on-premise, our vCenter infrastructure, and our process server, which happens to be our config server as well. So then we go and configure our target. We're replicating to Azure here. So these are the settings from Azure. We'll talk a little bit about these later. And then we finally select our virtual machines that we want to protect. So I've got 2 database servers here, DB1 and DB2. So when I select those 2 database servers, you notice that all this is grayed out. That's because the mobility agent hasn't been deployed to those VMs yet. So being database servers, they have multiple drives. So we might want to protect certain drives. So what we need to do is we need to install those mobility agents into those VMs. And this is the config server. So we have an IP for the config server, and we have the concept of a passphrase. So you'll see that here. So we can gather the mobility service installer from the config server, and you can see Linux and that mobility service deployments there as well. I'm going to copy that to our workload DB1, and we'll copy it to DB2 as well. So we'll do a wizard-based install for DB1 once that's copied, and we'll do a scripted install for DB2. So we want to install the mobility agents to those workloads first. So this is the wizard-based, just next. You need to copy the passphrase, which is a key that kind of identifies this agent as talking to that config server. So go ahead. We need to enter the IP address of the config server, then that passphrase. So then this workload being protected with that mobility service will then be recognized and accepted by that that config server. Once we've done that, just select the default location, next and install. So that's basically what a push would do if you didn't have that. So we're manually installing this before we actually replicate it. Okay, so with the scripted one, we actually have to extract the binaries. So there's this command to extract the binaries. And it's the same installer file for the mobility. So in the extract, you'll see the binaries for that installer. And then if you look at the next command, it's basically running the installer with the endpoint of the config server and the passphrase as a text file. Okay. So once the mobility agent's installed into those workloads, then we wait a while. We wait for the config server to update itself and then update the cloud that we now have that mobility service installed. So we'll look at the next step now. I'll just stop the video. I did this last night, so I'm fairly certain now that the mobility agent's installed. So let's jump back into here now. We'll go back to our VMware scenario, and we'll look to replicate now. So you have two options up here. As I mentioned, that construct supports backup and DR in the same vault. So I'm just using this one for DR. I click on replicate. What do I want to replicate? Now this is what we saw before in the video. So I'm going on-premise to my config server, which is this AS2, the VMware scenario. Click on OK here. My target, what am I replicating into in Azure? So I have a subscription, I have resource group. This is the resource group that I want to fail over into. So I might want to say a DR resource group or whatever. I can select storage accounts here. So you can actually select premium storage accounts. Now, one of the reasons why you might want to select a premium storage account versus a standard one is that when we actually fail over that VM into Azure, maybe it's an important VM. So we want it to run on premium storage. So you need to be kind of work out how you want to protect your VMs into premium storage. That's going to add added cost as well because premium storage accounts aren't cheap. So we have a log, an account for logs here. I have a diag one somewhere. Yeah, just use that account. We can configure the network it's going to fail over into now or later. So what you'd have before all of this is you'd have all your virtual networks and your storage account set up before this. I'm going to fail over into the back end. Okay. So we're at the next stage. We've configured our Azure environment. Now we want to protect those two VMs. So at DB1 and DB2 again. Let's select those two. Click on OK. And what you should see here now is because we have installed that mobility agent first, we have the ability to select which disk we want to replicate. Why is that important? Well, if we look at our DB, our database here has not allowing me to connect. Okay. What I was going to show you was our database has a number of disks. So the disk for E drive is actually a log file. It's a temp directory. We probably don't want to replicate that because there's might be a lot of churn on that disk. So we basically unselect it from these options. So by installing the mobility service first, we have the ability to actually select those disks that we want to replicate. And then it's just a case of clicking on OK. There's some capacity planning here, the replication policy. So we're going to be a continuous replication. We're going to get alerts if the RPO exceeds 15 minutes here. We might want to protect these two workloads together, so we have this concept of multi-VM consistency. So this is a DB group, and we select both of those. So they'll be protected together and recovered together as well. Click on OK, and just enable replication. And then that'll go away, and because the agent's already there, it'll start to replicate the changes or the initial replication up to Azure. And that's the VMware scenario. Once we've got that workload into Azure, then we can do a number of other things with it, which we'll go through shortly. Okay. All right, let's jump back into the slides. Okay, so that's the VMware protection scenario. We also support the Hyper-V protection scenario. The Hyper-V protection scenario is really based around the feature within Windows Server called Hyper-V Replica. So it uses that feature, and it's supported in 2012, 2012 R2, and 2016 now. We basically enable that feature and then allow us to, and that enables us to protect workloads into Azure. It's very easy to set up and configure. There are different deployment options. So if you only have a Hyper-V host, then you can actually do that with the Hyper-V site. They call it a Hyper-V site. You create a Hyper-V site within Azure, you add your Hyper-V host, and then you can start protecting VMs. If you've got System Center, Virtual Machine Manager. If you've got System Center, you've probably got Virtual Machine Manager for your servers because you sell it in the suite. They sell it in the suite. Then you protect based on what we call a VMM cloud. So you create a cloud within VMM, add all your virtual machines into that cloud, and then that will then you can enable replication for those. There is no need to install a mobility agent into the VM. That's the difference with the Hyper-V scenario. The Hyper-V scenario relies on the hypervisor and that feature within Hyper-V Replica. What does that mean? It means that you can actually replicate VMs that are turned off. Right? For the VMware scenario, your VM has to be turned on for you to replicate because it needs that mobility agent running inside the VM. So I'm not going to touch too much on the Hyper-V scenario. They also support now, this is fairly recent, the ability to select which disks you want to replicate to. Before that was a feature of the VMware scenario, but the Hyper-V scenario you can actually select which, so in that database scenario we could just select the C and D drive and forget about the E, which is for logs and temp files. For the AWS, the physical protection scenario, we're now selecting this option, not virtualized and other. So this works exactly the same as the VMware scenario. It uses a config server, it uses the mobility agent. The mobility agent, in this case, is not installed into a VMware VM, it's installed into a physical server. So if you think about it for the AWS scenario, if you've got infrastructure in AWS, you set up a config server inside AWS, the same subnet as all your VMs. You use that to deploy the mobility agent to those workloads in AWS. And because it's an Azure public service, it just needs internet access out of AWS into Azure, and you can replicate those VMs into Azure. So that's how we would move workloads out of AWS potentially. So just some guidance really around protecting these workloads. I mentioned before network bandwidth's important. We tested the service provider's link by flooding that network with replication traffic. Differences between VMware Hyper-V, really continuous replication. That link is always on. That means you get a variable RTO time. With the Hyper-V scenario, we have what we call a scheduled replication. And that scheduled replication is a feature of Hyper-V Replica. Can be as low as 30 seconds, 5 minutes, and 15 minutes. So you can select one of those three intervals. You're locked into those areas. The VMware scenario supports 5.56.0 versions. And I mentioned before the replica of offline VMs. Okay, so once those VMs are replicated into Azure, whether it's the Hyper-V scenario, the VMware scenario, or the physical scenario, this is what we can do with them. Okay. So if you look at the VMware side, you look at the Hyper-V side, they look fairly about the same, really. There's an additional planned failover for the Hyper-V scenario. The reason why we have that is actually, in that scenario, when you say we want to do a planned failover, it's like my VM's running on premises today. I want to, because of maintenance on my data center, I want to move it into the cloud, have it running in the cloud. So that planned failover is a case of failing over to the cloud. It runs in the cloud, and it enables what we call reverse replication back to on-premise. So then we can do a planned failover back to on-premise. The VMware scenario doesn't have that feature. We can only do an unplanned failover. But in saying that, after we've done a failover to Azure, we can do, from a VMware perspective, we can do a reprotect. From the Microsoft perspective, we can do a reverse replicate. So reverse replica is part of that planned failover. We're now replicating back our changes from Azure onto on-prem. For the VMware scenario, the reprotect is doing the same thing. It's reprotecting the changes that are made in Azure because your workload's now running in Azure, reprotecting those changes back into on-prem. But it does in a different way. For that, you need a process and config server that actually runs on VMware because it needs access to the disk within VMware. So they've kind of had a bit of feature parity here in terms of what you can do. I'll talk a little bit about some of these support. So let's go jump into another demo and look at, I'll close that. So we have, in the VMware scenario, we have this VM that I had protected before, app01. I've actually failed it over to Azure. So this is actually now running in Azure. I can see that here in my virtual machines. So app01 is running in Azure in this resource group. But it's still being protected from so if I click on here, these are the options that you saw before. Some of them are grayed out because it's now running in Azure. So the options I can do is I can change the recovery point. Because it's a VMware workload, I can jump back to any point in time where a replica was successful. So you can actually change when you want to recover to. This might be important if you had a virus attack, right? You had a virus attack at lunchtime. I want to jump back to a point that was in the morning before that lunchtime event. Okay. Sorry, there's a, go back there. So you can actually select all the different recovery points. You can see we're replicating fairly frequently here, and you see application consistent kind of points as well. Okay, so I'm going to commit this now. So I'm happy with this point in time that I failed over to. So I've actually logged into that VM, checked whether the data's fine, and I want to commit to that point in time. So once you've committed, that workload's there. We can actually then reprotect it, and then the changes made on this VM can then be pushed back down to the on-premise VM. So you now have DR for your VM running in Azure on-premise. Okay. All right. Let's Okay, so because Windows Server 2016 and System Center 2016 have been released now, GA, I've given you some guidance here on if you're going to use those workloads, what versions to use and kind of what's compatible, what's not compatible. So the config server today, they say it has to run on Windows Server 2012 R2. There's no official support for 2016 running that config server on 2016 yet, but I've managed to install it. It works, but it's not supported. The Hyper-V scenario is only greenfield support only. What does greenfield support only mean? It means that you have to run a pure 2016 environment to support a ASR with Hyper-V. So your Hyper-V site only has 2016 hosts. Your VMM 2016 is managing 2016 hosts only. You can't have VMM 2016 managing 2012 R2 hosts and 2016 hosts. So that's kind of the mixed. The mixed cloud support will be coming soon. And they'll probably support that with an update release. There's an additional link down there that gives you all the detailed requirements. So to some extent, 2016 is supported. The workload itself that you're replicating, that can be 2016, because we can have 2016 workloads in Azure today. So there's no issue there. Okay. What I want to kind of end on is really looking at ASR from a migration tool. Using ASR as a migration tool. So for those companies that want to move their on-premises workloads into Azure, we can use Azure Site Recovery to migrate those workloads into Azure. So why might you do this? Well, there's a shorter downtime. If you're thinking of moving like a large database server up into Azure, there's a lot of data that you have to move to Azure. You can't shut it down, move the data, and have that long outage. With Azure Site Recovery, we protect it into Azure, we replicate while the physical or the virtual workload is still running on premises. And then we basically do a switch. So the steps really to do this, there's six steps to really do this. So we have to create the vault, which we've already done, set up the infrastructure, whether it's the VMware scenario, whether it's Hyper-V scenario, whether it's the physical scenario as well. Then we start replicating that workload or the application. So selecting that VM, exactly what we did, replicate. The initial replica goes up there. Might take a while depending on bandwidth, depending on the size of that virtual machine. Then we should really do a test failover, right? A test failover means that we're starting up the VM in Azure in isolation of the running VM on premises. That means that we can make sure the data's there, it's consistent, and we're happy that the replication is being successful. So validate that that VM is working. Then we do a failover. So that's what I just showed before. We failed over that VM. It's now running in Azure. We could either re-protect it back to on-prem, or we can do what we call complete the migration. So complete the migration is basically saying, I now don't want to have that VM being protected in Azure Site Recovery. I want to have it removed out of there and have it running properly in Azure. So there's actually a button for that. And we'll show you that button. I'll show you what that button looks like. You would have seen it before. So that's that button there, complete migration. So our VM's now running in Azure. I haven't re-protected it back to on-prem. So the on-prem VM is turned off. And we just do complete migration. It gives you a warning, or it tells you this VM will no longer be protected by Site Recovery. That means you're going to save money as well because you're not paying for that instance for protection. Click on OK, and then it will basically delete this VM from the Azure Site Recovery Vault. But the VM's running in Azure already. So that's how you would migrate. You use Azure Site Recovery as a migration tool. So again, it supports the VMware scenario, Hyper-V scenario, the physical scenario as well. And we actually do this with customers. This is how we move their workloads into Azure. We use Azure Site Recovery to do that. Okay. Okay, we're going to, there's some links here, and you'll get this deck as well as part of the recording. But there's some links here that you might find helpful in your to help you, test Azure Site Recovery. The version support, when you sign up for Azure Site Recovery, it's actually free for the first 31 days. So it could cost you nothing to migrate your workloads from on-premise into Azure. After that, they start charging you based on how you're protecting. So if it's an on-prem to Azure scenario, you're paying $31.84 Australian dollars per protected workload. That's why once you've done your migration, you want to do that complete migration because you'll save that money. If it's a site-to-site, physical site to another site, that's a $20.38 kind of cost there. I haven't really covered the Azure to Azure, which is currently in preview. So that's from one Azure region to another Azure region. So say you had something in the Sydney Azure data center, wanted to DR that to Melbourne. That's the Azure to Azure. Go have a look at Nirmal's session, which is tomorrow. He'll be covering that as a demo. And it's currently in private preview as well. Okay. So going to change tack now and look at the backup to the cloud scenario. So the backup to the cloud scenario, if we look at what AWS has there in terms of their strategy, they rely on the third-party vendor support, which we'll cover a little bit about what those products and vendors that support backup to the cloud scenario. They have what we call cloud native, so using the storage snapshots to take snapshots of the data, take snapshots of the VMs running in Azure. Again, the Azure part with the Azure backup is a lot more advanced in terms of their features and functionality. It's really moved to an area where it's backup as a service. So we use the same construct, the recovery services vault, for holding our backups. We can do backups of VMs running in Azure. That's called the Azure IS backup. And we can also support the on-premise backup scenario. From files and folders, to using DPM, to using what we'll talk about as the Azure backup server. We have things like backup and retention policies. We can support application consistent backups as well. And also Azure does support the third parties. A lot of the third parties that support AWS as a backup target can also support Azure as a backup target as well. All right, so let's drill down into the Azure IS VM backup scenario. So in this scenario, we have our VM. It's running in Azure. It's running our workload. Now, we need to protect that somehow. How do we protect that? Well, previously, you could install a backup server into Azure and then back up to that backup server, for instance. But that's going to be costly because you're paying for the compute cost, the storage cost of that backup server. With the Azure IS VM backup, it is very easy to deploy and use. We don't need any backup infrastructure. We can set up self-service restore and backup, and it's really backup as a service. We enable it, it runs, we can do our restore, and so on. So the costing model also follows that. So some of the things that you can actually do, you can restore the entire VM, you can restore individual disks, and currently in preview is the ability to restore just a single item. So there's a session on Friday where Stefan will be covering a bit of that recovery aspect as well. Very easy to do with that item level recovery. What that also means is if we look at our DR scenario where we've protected a workload into Azure, then we've failed over and completed the migration, it's now running in Azure, from day one we can actually protect that as well. So it's now built into the VM properties where we can select our VM and do a backup. So I'll show you that now. So if let's make sure that, okay, the migration's completed. So if I look here now, I shouldn't see any items that are replicated. Okay. So the VM that I have, this is the VM now that's running in Azure. It's running on premium storage. We can protect also premium storage VMs as well. You'll notice that there's an option down here within the VM for backup. And they've added this a couple months ago where from each of the VMs running in Azure, we can actually schedule an IaaS backup of that. So IaaS backup, there are a couple limitations. You can only do one backup a day. If you want to do more, then you have to look at another solution. So we have, first of all, select our backup vault. So we have a recovery services vault for backup. And really the policy that we want to define. So this is a simple policy, daily backup at 9 p.m., retain 5, basically. Have 5 copies of that. We can do a more comprehensive policy, a yearly comprehensive, where we do backups daily, or basically keep a backup daily, retained for 180 days, up to yearly, up for 10 years, for instance, or even longer. So we have the ability to define how our backup policies look like. So you can actually create a new one here, and you can see all the options that you have here. Bear in mind, if you're going to have lots of backups, that's going to add to the cost, because how you get charged for Azure backup is how much backup data you're consuming in Azure as well. Okay, so it's backup instance plus the amount of storage you're using. So let's just do a daily backup retain 5. And it's just a case of clicking enable backup. And enable backup will then go away and protect that. So go there. I'll show you some VMs that are already backed up. So let's go back to my backup vault. I've got 11 items that are being backed up here. So the Azure virtual machine is what I'm looking for, because there's a VM running in Azure. So I've got a number of VMs already being protected. The top one there, I just enabled that before. Enabling it will not actually kick it off. Remember, the schedule is 9 p.m., so it won't kick off until 9 p.m. So this one that I enabled before, it hasn't done the initial replica yet. But you have the ability to say, back up that now. So it's like ad hoc backup. So if you want an additional backup to the one that is scheduled, you can do ad hoc backup. And a new feature within Azure Backup is the retention period. So if you actually delete a backup, Azure will still retain that for 14 days. So it's to counter things like ransomware. Someone goes, hacks your account, deletes all your backups. They're still going to be there for 14 days after that. What else do we have? So we look at some VMs that are already being backed up. You see the options here, restore VM. This is a new file server recovery, so item level recovery of files within that virtual machine as well. So this is really backup as a service for VMs running in Azure. So what do we talk about the next scenario? Your workload is still on-prem, and we now need to back up and protect those VMs. So the whole backup as a service technology revolves around something called MAAS. It's the Microsoft Azure Recovery Services agent. It's an agent that gets installed onto various workloads to enable protection to Azure. So if you're protecting, so we're talking about the on-premise scenario now. If we're protecting files and folders, we can actually install this agent into a running Windows VM or workload on premises, and it will support the backup of folders and files only. There's no Linux support for this. So the latest version is 2.09.62. This gets updated quite frequently as well, so keep up to date with that. If we're backing up VMs, now that could be Hyper-V VMs or VMware VMs, or even application servers, database, SQL, we can set up what we call the Azure Backup Server, or we can use System Center DPM. Azure Backup Server is basically DPM under the covers. We'll talk a little bit about that. So we're installing that MAAS agent onto our backup server, and that's integrating with our Azure Backup Service in Azure and backing up workloads and VMs to Azure. We also have the option here, the ability to use the Azure import-export So if we have a huge amount of data to move into the cloud, we can use that Azure import-export to put it on disk first, ship that disk to Microsoft, and they can put it into your storage account. So a bit like what AWS has with their Snowball. This Mars agent is also used in Azure Site Recovery. Because the Vault construct is the same, we actually use the Mars agent on Hyper-V hosts as well as to do that replication. Yep. So that's where that Mars agent is used. Let's talk about Venus. Venus is the code name for Azure Backup Server. So it's not called Venus anymore, it's Azure Backup Server. So this slide really talks about the differences between Azure Backup Server and DPM. It's basically